Hello, everybody. Welcome back again to the episode 2 of The Decode, a podcast series by Zoom. In the previous episode, we talked about DPDP, and today we'll be shifting our focus on a very important part of the DPDP ecosystem, which is the consent manager. Joining us, we have Prerna, the legal counsel of Zoom, who would be helping us in decoding the importance of consent managers. So let's get started. Hi, Prerna. Welcome back to Zoom's podcast.
Hi, Gitika. Feels great to be back.
So to begin with, help us understand what does consent manager mean and why has it become so important in this data-driven world?
Right. So to continue our discussion on the DPDP Act from where we left off in the last episode, the consent manager is basically a middleman between a data principal, that is an individual who shares their data, and a data fiduciary who processes the personal data. Essentially, it is a mechanism wherein a data principal should have the ability to give, manage, review, or withdraw the consent that they provide towards their personal data. Essentially, it is, I would say, very similar to the account aggregator framework. However, this spans across industries. This basically helps the data principals to have complete control over their data, and it helps them to hold the consent managers accountable.
So basically, consent manager is something that looks after the data of an individual. So while processing the data, while processing the consent, how the consent manager makes sure that the individual's data is kept secure.
Right. To answer your question, there are several ways in which a consent manager must ensure that the personal data is secure and consents are kept safe with the consent manager. However, to keep it short, I'll go over a few important points. The first would be the consent manager needs to have a record of the consent, whether how the consents have been given, denied, or withdrawn, the notice preceding the consent or accompanying the request for consent. And the second would be the consent manager needs to maintain a website or an app or both at its discretion to help the data principal to access the services of the consent manager. Third, and more importantly, this point is where the consent manager should make the personal data available to a data fiduciary in a manner where the data should not be readable by the consent manager itself. So this basically adds an extra layer of privacy and protection. And one more important point would be that the consent manager should have secure data practices. That is, they should have encryption, secure data storage, and access controls in place.
You mentioned about data fiduciaries, right? We hear a lot of conflicts of interest. So how does the consent manager try their best to avoid such intersection of interest in front of the data fiduciaries?
Good point, Gitika. So the draft DPDP rule suggests that the consent manager should always maintain a fiduciary capacity towards the data principal, which means they must always prioritize the interests of the data principals over any other party. So to ensure that, the consent manager must have processes in place where any key managerial person should not have a directorship or any financial interest in the consent manager, so that this does not influence their decisions. For example, if a consent manager's director holds a certain number of shares in the consent manager platform, this could influence their decisions and in turn affect the data principal's right of transparency and accountability towards the consent manager.
Well answered, Prerna. I'm curious to know, is the consent manager allowed to allocate their responsibilities to some third party or any other person?
This is actually one of the interesting aspects of the consent manager framework. So the DPDP draft rules clearly state that the consent manager must not assign or subcontract the performance of its obligations to any other entity. This is to ensure trust with the data principals and to ensure that the transparency and accountability of the entire consent managing framework remains transparent. The second thing would be that, however, how this will be implemented practically in future would need more clarity, which hopefully we will have very soon from the Ministry of Electronics and IT.
So to nail this discussion, the last one is very evident. How does the consent manager keep up with the rules and regulation?
So to answer your question, the consent manager should have regular checks and audit mechanisms in place in order to audit and review their control mechanisms, their security controls, etc. This is basically done to ensure that the consent manager is adhering to the regulation, to the DPDP Act. It's all about regular checks and audits. So the consent manager should have audit mechanisms in place to review the security controls and data storage practices, how the consents are stored and reviewed. The second thing would be that this entire process of audit and review will ensure that the consent manager continues their registration as per how the Data Protection Board has envisaged the process. And the findings are then reported to the board. And in case there are any issues that arise with the same, the consent manager is required to rectify these issues. So this helps to keep the entire system transparent and to help the consent manager be accountable for their actions.
Very well answered, Prerna. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your legal insights on this crucial topic.
Thanks, Gitika.
If you also found this discussion valuable, then do not forget to hit the like button and share the decode in your network. See you soon. Bye bye.